Welcome everybody to Krista Rhinehart Presents. I know most of you, but not all of you. I'm Craig Chalkwist. I'm Department Chair of East-West Psychology, and I have the honor of being the chair for a committee. So I'd like to introduce that committee, actually. The second member is Janice Phelps, core faculty in EWP. And Dr. Maren Hansen's on the phone with us. And Doctor, since you can't be here in the room with us except your voice, would you like to say a little bit about your background so we know?
Oh, okay, yes. I have a PhD in psychology, and I'm on the adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm also an ordained Unitarian minister, and pretty much my entire adult life, I've been involved in issues of psychology and women's spirituality.
Great, thank you, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, for those of you who have not been at a dissertation defense before, I thought I would just run through what we're going to do here in the order that we'll do it. So what I will do momentarily is introduce you. And then our doctoral candidate will have about 45 minutes to present her work to everybody. And after that takes place, by CIIS custom, we're going to open the floor for questions, starting with our external reader, and give her an opportunity first. And then after that, our second member, and then I will have an opportunity to ask questions. And then we'll open it up to all of you, so that you can ask some questions too. And at some point right around there, after you have asked a few questions, the committee will leave the room, and I'll call Dr. Hansen on my cell phone, and we'll confer briefly and then come back in. So you'll have a chance to converse with the candidate while we're out of the room as well as in the room. So that's what we will do for our ritual/rite of passage. So with that, please welcome Krista for this presentation.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. I wanted to start out with a story because I'm talking about the feminine, which can be very difficult to talk about on an intellectual level, so I wanted to bring a little bit of story and connection to the imaginal a little bit. And I took this from one of my participants that she engaged with this very ancient, wise woman in her experience. And
It's a little bit faint. Thank you for asking.
Let's try this.
is this okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So I took this from her experience. So she had an encounter with a very wise, ancient woman figure, and this was the dialogue that came out of it, and the story emerged. So I'm going to share this with you, so feel free to close your eyes if you want. So she's talking about this dialogue with this ancient woman. She says, "She's always with me, that she's my biggest ally, and that a long time ago, over 1,000 years ago," she said, over 13,000 moons ago, she and her tribe women, the women that surrounded her, were extremely powerful seers and wisdom keepers. They had the capacity to see way beyond their time, and could even see into our time right now. And they knew that the things that are happening during our time right now, they knew this was going to happen. And that at a certain point in their bloodline, women would start to wake up to this ancient form of wisdom, and that back in their time, something really terrible happened, where the wisdom that they carried, which is far beyond what we can understand now, because so much has been lost. She told me so much has been lost that we can't even fathom with our imagination. Maybe if we stretched our imaginations to the furthest points, we could imagine what powers and capacities they had as women, as wisdom keepers, as seers, and that they passed this wisdom down from generation to the next through their voice, through their words, through their stories, and it had become so powerful because there was such a long period of time where this wisdom was being passed from one generation to the next, and they were cultivating it as it was being passed on. So one generation would cultivate it to a certain point and then pass it on. And the next generation would carry it and it would become more and more powerful. And at the point of this grandmother's life, at the point of her life, it was the most powerful it has ever been, and that something came over them that was terrible. And they had to make a decision to either continue to pass on the wisdom through their voice and their words and risk being killed for it, or stop passing it on and assure that their daughters would survive. So this grandmother in particular made the decision to stop passing on the wisdom so that she could assure that her daughters would survive. So when that decision was made, some of the seers and wisdom keepers got together and came up with the idea of somehow received the idea that they could encode their wisdom in the DNA and continue to pass the wisdom through the bloodline. So it was essential that they kept the bloodline alive, because the coding for their wisdom that they had cultivated for over thousands of years was imprinted on the DNA. And they knew that that was a safe place to hide the wisdom. So the forces that were silencing them couldn't find it, couldn't get rid of it. The only catch was that they had to make sure the bloodline continued long enough so they could reach this time where women could begin to remember how to access that wisdom and where to look. They knew that there would be women in their bloodline that would have the courage. It takes enormous amounts of courage and awareness to be able to know where to look. To actually do it, because it had threatened the lives of the grandmothers since that woman's time. So it was a threat and a taboo for a long, long time, and it takes courage to break through that. And so she made it very clear that I could access her at any time. That's their whole gig. Their whole purpose comes down to this. Comes down to someone in the bloodline being able to carry on the wisdom that they cultivated. They are banking on this. So that's what she told me. There is some serious allyship, some serious support coming from the grandmothers and the ancestors to help women remember this. And it goes so far beyond their logical capacity. It's coming through dream, it's coming through ceremony, it's coming through conversations with the sacred. All of these things, these different avenues that have diminished or been labeled as insignificant or make-believe. So this is a depth psychological inquiry into the visionary and transformative experience of the Reemerging Feminine. So I first want to share what got me interested in this topic. And I started to inquire about my topic around the time of 2012, when there was a lot of prophecies talking about end of one world and the entry into a new world. So I was very curious about this idea of ending one paradigm and stepping into the new paradigm. And I think there have been many scholars that have talked about it being a new consciousness or reconnecting to the earth consciousness. And I was curious about, well, what is this consciousness that is emerging? Because I felt very called to be a part of it and help to cultivate that shift in paradigm. So in Craig's class, actually, he taught us to, when we look for our topic, to allow our topic to come to us and to pay attention to our dreams and really listen to and really connect with it on a soul level. So when I was sitting with this question of consciousness, which is such a big topic to even talk about, I asked this question of what is this new consciousness? And I was met with a vision of the feminine re-emerging and aspects of the feminine that we lost and were disconnected to, that is coming back. And I started to have these visions of being able to go back and connect with that wisdom that we once had when we were really connected to the earth. So I started to become interested if other people were having these experiences, and I actually found women that had been having those experiences. And I met with this woman, and she had been traveling around the world with other women that were having similar visions, and they were going to sacred sites to what she called reignite the feminine codes and bring back the feminine. And so I felt like this was a strong topic for me, and the vision that came just felt like I couldn't really say no to it. So I decided to interview women that, actually I wasn't even going to limit it to just women, but through my recruiting process it was all women that came. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And it seemed actually synchronistic that I ended up just looking at women. And so my research question was, how is the feminine reemerging and appearing in the lives of contemporary Americans? And I wanted to look at it from a Western culture perspective, because I didn't want to get in too much to other cultures, but really see how it's coming back from people that have been grown up in this Western, more patriarchal way of being. And I looked at a lot of different literature of people that were doing things that were similar, like looking at dreams and artwork and making claims that the feminine is transforming consciousness, but I didn't see a lot of the links of how they were making those statements, and so I wanted to really include those in my study and actually ask participants, how is this experience leading to some sort of change in your life? So that was my second research question. And I also want to start with my key terms, just so you get an understanding of what I even mean by feminine, because it's such a big umbrella topic and very hard to define. And Ebede can attest to that. He was my writing tutor, and I was like, he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I can't explain it. It's an experience. It's something that we've gone through, and I cry in his office and try and figure out how to define it and look at all these people that defined it, but there's all these critiques around it. So I took a different route. But the first thing that I want to make really clear is that when I'm talking about the feminine, I'm not talking about gender, that only women are feminine and only men are masculine, but that every person has their own internal feminine and masculine, and that these are two polarizing energies that exist in all life. And given the complexity of the term, I found it hard to come up with a definition, and by its nature, it's mysterious, and it's hard to just put it in a very, strict definition that kind of limits its expression. Especially in Western culture, we have a language that doesn't always express this, and we lost a lot of the ancient languages when we were connected to this. So I decided to just talk about different qualities of the feminine, and so I could give the reader some sense of what I'm talking about. And so I took 5 of these qualities from Alexandre, and she came up with these qualities because she found them within as qualities of the dark feminine throughout different cultures. So the first quality is embodiment, which refers to the conscious relationship to the body, where the body is not separate from the mind. And relational, which is the feminine's tendency to connect and merge and focus on the collective, whereas the masculine is drawn to individuate and separate. Platonic, which the Greek meaning of this word is in the earth, and it speaks to the descent and the encounters of what's in the underworld. And cyclicity, which describes the feminine's cyclical nature, whereas masculine is very linear. The feminine, there is no beginning and there is no end. And antinomian, which is what sits outside of what is rational and normative and socially acceptable. It's the inner faith that is not tainted by oppression, assumptions, cultural and religious morals. And then I also added 2 of my own because I felt these were also really important, which is receptivity which includes the process of drawing energy towards you, whereas the masculine is about action, and the feminine, you can enter into the stillness and become receptive. And the imaginal, which includes the unseen world and what's connected to the instincts, the feelings, and the imagination that can be expressed through symbolism. And the second key term is visions. So what constituted a vision in this study? So the visions constitute a material emerging from the unconscious that can be attributed to the feminine through imagery, symbol, and somatic experiences. This will include dreams, unconscious material accessed in altered states of consciousness, and non-ordinary appearances of the feminine in external form. So it was common that people would have a vision, but they would also have some sort of follow-up, either another dream or an encounter in nature. So I included that, their main vision, but also how it unfolded over time. And so I interviewed 6 different women, and I analyzed each individual vision, but I also did a group visionary experience because as part of my methodology, which I'll get to, it's about collaborating with other people and seeing them as not just participants, but co-researchers and including them. So I had them come to my house, and I brought my drum and had everyone enter into a shamanic journey together with this same question of connecting with how is the feminine wanting to speak through at this time. And so we had each person go through their visionary experience, and then we talked about it for a while, and it was actually pretty powerful because each person shared their experience, and then we started to make connections with each other. So it's kind of weaving this collective story together, and there were certain themes that came up through that I will get to later. Next, I want to talk about my methodology. So the primary methodology I used was organic inquiry, and I had to find, again, a methodology that would allow me to really look at the feminine, where it wouldn't be limited to certain structures that kind of keep those values out. So I looked for a methodology that embraces these feminine values. So organic inquiry is one that does that, and it includes the subjective experience, and it values the intuition, and it has you engage with the research on a soul level. And that's one of the requirements of it, is that you are connecting with the topic in a way that's beyond your personal self, that you have some sort of, you could almost think of it as a soul quest, where you're allowing something from beyond you to come through you, and some sort of engagement with that practice. So the secondary methodology was the Mattock Analysis, which is designed to systematically identify meaningful patterns and themes which allow the researcher to extract and identify common expressions of the feminine. So this was a way of me applying organic inquiry and creating a collective story. So I looked at the individual visions and the group visions that came, and I went through and looked for what are the common patterns and messages and meaning that came through. And I also was using a depth psychological lens. So it was the framework that I was looking at the research study, but also how I was going about interpreting the visions. So depth psychological lens focuses on what's beneath the surface of thought, word, and action, and looks at the inclinations and impulses of the soul that they are rooted in. And it also not only looks at the symbols as an individual experience, but the symbol as a collective experience. So considering that my individual participants may have a symbol come up but I wanted to see how that symbol is known collectively and how it's shown up throughout time. So I used two different depth psychological methods that allowed me to apply this lens. And the first one is active imagination, which is one of the practices that I used, like I shared before. Organic inquiry requires you to go through some sort of process where you can access knowledge beyond the personal self. So the way that I did that is active imagination is a process that Jung used, which is to have the person dialogue with the images and the unconscious. And so the way that I did it was, my way is doing it with a drum, to go into an altered state of consciousness, to imagine myself in the vision and allow the images, and it was almost like I became a part of the vision, and that allowed me to really connect to it in an embodied level and to really experience it. I felt moments in the vision where I was like, whoa, I can feel something in me transitioning, and that allowed me to understand it from an embodied experience before actually talking about it. And the second one was amplification. So after I went through that process, I picked out what different symbols were that stood out, and I looked at what the cultural parallels are to that. So amplification involves the use of mythic, historical, and cultural parallels in order to magnify the metaphorical content of a dream, or in this case, vision. So it's looking at the symbol and seeing, and I used depth psychological literature and history and myth to see what that symbol means on more of a collective level when I was doing the interpretations. So after completing this study, I came to find 5 different themes. And the first one is the ancient wise woman. And if I were to pick only one theme out of the whole dissertation, it would be this, because it at least appeared, at least minimally, in every single person's experiences, but it was also a big aspect of people's experiences. And this ancient wise woman showed up as either a really old woman, sometimes toothless, who couldn't even speak anymore, and a couple people, it was a woman from way back in time, like an ancient priestess, someone who's very connected to the earth and has this relationship to the unseen world, and that's what this woman really invoked in people, was this reconnection to the earth and earth consciousness, and helped them reconnect to doing ritual and ceremony. So that was what some people said happened afterwards. They became more engaged and realized this connection to the ancient world, and that this wisdom that we once had thousands of years ago, we're still able to access within ourselves. And she's a powerful teacher for being a powerful healer as well. I want to share a couple examples, and this is an example where a woman's talking about her encounter with this ancient woman, which later revealed herself to be Grandmother Spider. And she says, "And as I have been in conversation with Spider since then, the waves of the web seem really important and seem central to the indigenous wisdom that I'm called to carry and express. And I've recognized that Spider is connected to the grandmother transculturally. So there's this understanding that human beings have had over time that Spider is connected to the ancestors, and especially the grandmother. And the interconnectivity that is represented or symbolized by the web is a really important piece of the indigenous feminine wisdom that needs to be brought forth at this point. And as human beings, remembering their interconnectivity with everything else, because that's what's felt so different between the two consciousnesses that I've been sitting between. the consciousness of city, Western, industrialized society, and the more natural rhythms that human beings have been in and out of since the beginning of time, or since the beginning of humanity. That interconnectivity is one of the huge things that has been forgotten and allows industrialized society to continue to run its course and destroy the fabric of life. So this particular experience, the spider became the teacher about the connecting to that web and the thinking layer of Earth and being able to create relationships with the unseen world. So the next theme is feminine consciousness. And this is an experience that several people had where they started to understand this different way of perceiving the world that actually required them to break out of these Western structures and worldview so that they could sense more into the unseen world and the imaginal and connect with the ancestors and the feminine more fully. So the type of knowledge that doesn't require empirical evidence but is evident in the synchronicity, in the way that it shows up in the intuition. So women were finding that encountering the ancient wise woman was opening their consciousness to the unseen world. And I have a couple examples of these women sharing about this perception opening. She says, "It shifted my understanding that there is an unseen interior world to things that in Western consciousness cannot be perceived. It cannot be perceived from our place in Western consciousness. Our consciousness has to shift in order to perceive the ancestral world, for instance, the world of the dead." So I've been able to start to understand that and really deepen into conversation with the ancestral worlds or the unseen worlds without needing any kind of empirical evidence that it's happening. The evidence comes through synchronicities. And another woman shares, and she's referring to the ancient wise woman. She's tapping me into this part of me that knows this whole other language that I didn't know that I had until I started to interact with it in this different way. And she shared that over time, this is when she started to engage more in rituals and ceremonies and divination. And ketonic, which if you remember was one of the qualities that I talked about at the beginning, and this image is the image of the descent, which showed up in a few different people's experiences. One was going down and descending into a dark basement and encountering the dark goddess there. And another was sitting at the bottom of the lake and incubating there. And another person was witnessing this ancient wise woman surrender to her death and descend down into a cenote where the land of the dead existed, where other people had been sacrificed before. And a couple of these participants in their descent encountered a dark goddess. And a few things that people mentioned that came up that they were able to reconnect to was their creativity and repressed sexuality and passion and power that was hidden in the depths. Another person described it as this, the dark feminine has this intensity and this vitality, and after encountering her and integrating her, she felt this fierceness in herself, which is sort of more of this, kind of dark mother sort of energy that is loving underneath all of that. It's all out of love. So one participant shares that through this work, being and knowing the divine has deeply taught me how to pull my energy together, how to channel my energy into the creative aspects of the universe and what that creativity manifests as, how it is driven through me as dance and writing, through counseling work and gardening, and just how sacred the sexual energy is, because that is the creative energy.